Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Sundermeyer. I'm the senior pastor here at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta, and welcome to the start of Mental Health Connections Week. We welcome everyone who is here live in the room, and of course, everyone who is live streaming or who will tune in later on demand. We're so thankful that you're participating in this really important week. We are largely here tonight as a collaborative effort between First Presbyterian Church, the Samaritan Counseling Center, and Will for Hope. The Will for Hope Foundation was founded by the family of Kate Monk, a member of First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And truth be told, this wouldn't happen without the Will for Hope Foundation. And we're so thankful for their energy and effort around these important conversations as it relates to mental health care. And so I'd like to introduce to you Kate Monk, who I just referenced a minute ago, who is part of the family that helped launch Will for Hope, and I'd invite you to give her a round of applause and welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Tony. First, I want to say thank you to First Presbyterian Church for hosting today's presentation, as well as providing the live stream capabilities for those of you watching remotely. I also want to thank Katie Sundermeyer and the Samaritan Counseling Center for wholeheartedly getting behind this effort. When I first sat down with Tony, Katie, and Rob Sparks, and I know he's out here somewhere, back in 2019, to tell them about the Will for Hope Foundation, they not only were supportive of our mission, but eager and willing to work together to create opportunities in order to educate and support one another around the difficult subject of mental health. This topic is often uncomfortable, but it's a critical one and much needed, especially in today's times. On July 5th, 2016, I received the news that my twin brother, Will, had taken his own life. He was 38. Some of you here or listening today knew Will. He was a bright, funny, kind-hearted child with an endearing smile. He was a passionate musician. He had a true love for playing the guitar, and he was an accomplished tennis player. He had tons of friends from early childhood through his high school years off at boarding school and on into college, where he played college tennis. Will loved people, and people loved him. But that is not all. Will struggled hard with depression and addiction over the years, and his family struggled with him. For about a 20-year period, we were a direct witness to his struggles and everything that he went through. Will was treated by professionals. There were countless doctors, numerous medications, and there was even a 3-month stay in a long-term rehab. Will would have periods where he was successfully working. He worked in commercial real estate and living a normal life, only to fall back into the cycle all over again. This was a living nightmare for Will, since he so desperately wanted a quick fix and to be normal, as he would often say. At the time of Will's death, he had been on a good path with no real setbacks or depressive episodes for almost 3 years. He was working, attending regular AA meetings, playing tennis again, and he was recently engaged. It appeared that Will was in a really good pace to everyone around him. I can only think that when Will decided to end his life on that hot July day, it was the first time he felt relief from the pain and darkness that he faced for far too long. About a year after Will died, we realized as a family that we have a decision to make. We can continue to turn inward and rehearse the unanswerable questions of what ifs and why didn't I, or we could find a way to turn outward, to celebrate all that was good about Will and to try and turn the tragedy of losing him into hope for others. It was from this place that we started the Will for Hope Foundation. The primary mission of Will for Hope is to provide funding and to support programs necessary to bring awareness to mental illness, programs that will help break the stigma around mental illness and offer ways for people to seek help and connect with others. Will generally did not want people to know that he had depression. He felt like it made him look inferior, defective, particularly around his professional colleagues, and we didn't talk about it much outside of our family. His struggles consumed family holidays and gatherings, but we often didn't discuss them with others. What we've now found is that there is incredible healing that comes with sharing one's struggles. You'll hear, your brother had depression, me too, or my sister has it, or my best friend faces addiction, or my father-in-law struggles with anxiety. Whatever the condition may be, there is hope when you know that you're not alone. So if there's anything to take away from Will's story, is to start talking. Talk about the importance of mental health. The more open and honest people are at sharing stories about themselves and their families, stigma is reduced and lives will be saved. And that gives us great hope. So if you'd like to learn more about Will's story or the Will for Hope Foundation, we have a website. It's www.willforhope.org. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account, and you can learn more. And this is really the first of our speaker series we had scheduled last year, but were suddenly shut down due to COVID. So I'm really grateful for Katie and the opportunity that we can finally kick off this very important week. Thank you.
I am so glad to see all of you in person, to see those who are live streaming and who later will access this recorded version. When Kate and I reconvened, even in the midst of the pandemic, but knowing that we wanted to offer something, we wanted to get who is, in our opinion, one of the finest Atlanta speakers available, in Dr. Lauren Edwards. We wanted to have good content, and then we really wanted to continue to help people make connections with one another and have conversations and be able to support one another in ways that are meaningful. And so with that intention, Dr. Edwards has made a handout for you when you leave. We'll also put this online, and you can access this if you're watching now, or later you'll be able to see the handout as well. And we have these small group opportunities. And so this is something that, yes, we started in 2019. We're finally launching tonight. But we want to keep doing. And so the small groups are kind of getting worked out. But as you hear Dr. Edwards speak, and if you want to get connected this week, let me know if you haven't already signed up for a small group, and I would be glad to help you get connected. There's no prep for the small group except for to hear the lecture. But then you'll be in a small group with 6 or 10 people in order just to be able to process out loud some of what you heard and questions that you have in ways that you can get further support. Every small group has a therapist and a pastor who's present. So, Samaritan Counseling Center of Atlanta is all I want to say about that is we're thankful to First Pres for housing us, and we're thankful to Will for Hope for financing this that made this possible. It's really great to be able to collaborate. We have so many people with so many resources in our midst, and the more we can connect and share with one another the gifts that God's given each one of us, the more it is as it has been intended to be. So, Dr. Lauren Edwards, please read her great bio. We tried to give you that up front in case you don't know Lauren personally, but she is a woman who is invested in the church, and she has been one of the prime consultants for me the last 5 years at the Samaritan Counseling Center of Atlanta, and speaks at a bunch of schools and is adjunct at Emory. And I think it was a really meaningful conversations as Lauren and Kate and I talked about what you're going to hear presented tonight. So I hope you find it meaningful. And in the midst of, Lauren's got a husband, Chip, who's grown up at First Pres. Somebody I asked if they knew you, and they're like, is she married to Chip? And I was like, yes, she is. She claims him happily. And they have 2 young boys. So thank you for being here and carving out this time tonight. Oh, and I'm going to pray for us. Loving God, thank you for this space. Thank you for each person here. Thank you for each person in their home, live streaming. Thank you for each person who will benefit from this content. And would you be at work? Would you open our hearts and minds by the power of your Holy Spirit? Meet us here, strengthen us, help us be vulnerable, help us grow, and connect with one another in ways that are life-giving. And remind us how much we are loved and the beautiful privilege we have to love one another. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate those introductions. This has been a great thing to be a part of already. And I want to talk today about something that is really important and really painful. I want to talk about the feeling of being unlovable. And this is something that we recognize by a million different names, but at the core it comes down to feeling like you aren't fully attached to the world, like you're a burden to others, and that somehow you are fundamentally flawed. And so we break down this experience into 3 components. This is really about a lack of belonging, that you just don't fit. You just don't connect where you need and want to. You don't have enough relationally out there. This is also about believing yourself to be a burden, what we call perceived burdensomeness. You feel like you take too much, or you take more than you give. You feel like ultimately you create more harm than you do good in the world. And then finally, this is about shame. This is about that experience of feeling yourself to be broken somehow. And so those three things are really important to talk about because, first of all, this is a completely normal human experience. You have all been there at some point in time, and you will all be there at some point in the future. And so we have moments, and sometimes we have many, many moments of feeling unlovable. And that is okay, and that is also something that we can work to change. It comes and it goes, it waxes and it wanes. The second reason this is important is because this experience of being unlovable creates a vulnerability to suicide. This triad is so painful when it comes together that it makes people believe that their life is simply not worth living anymore. And so, I want to piggyback on what Kate said. This is something that we have to start talking about so that we can expose it and we can figure out how we change these things for each other. And so we don't want to stop there. It's also important to think about the antithesis of being unlovable, which is being lovable. We need to figure out how we get to a sense of belonging, how we see ourselves as having value and contributing in the world, and then also how we overcome shame and find dignity and compassion. And so we're going to talk about those three concepts more, hopefully, than we talk about that experience of being unlovable. And so I want to illustrate this for everybody by talking about my first client. So when I was starting my doctoral training, I was given 5 clients. I'd had 1 class under my belt, and everybody comes in and thinks I'm a therapist at that point. So I want to tell you guys about Malcolm. First person I ever sat with who thought I was a therapist. Malcolm gave me a run for my money. So he was a 19-year-old, fratty, sarcastic, funny, deeply wounded African-American kid. And he was a kid in some ways. He was a child because he had been neglected frequently. He had not had the care that he needed to in order to really grow up. Malcolm also felt like a man. He had lived a lifetime before he came to me. He had experienced and witnessed a tremendous amount of suffering. And so in some ways, he was a very old soul. And I really like to talk about Malcolm because he illustrates the power of everyday relationships. Malcolm went through a total transformation in the year that I worked with him because of other people, because of what happened outside of our therapy sessions, and he definitely did some work in session as well. But really, he illustrates the power of the relationships that we have just in our day-to-day experiences. And Malcolm, is important, and he also helps illustrate that because when I walked in and started working with Malcolm, the only skill set I had under my belt was active listening. So we'd had 1 class, and it was just about how you sit with another person and accurately reflect back what you hear, which actually ends up being one of the most powerful things you can do. And research shows that sometimes first-year therapists who have no experience at all get rated as being better than some of the experts in their field because they are so good at active listening, because they just work on sitting with someone and really, really hearing them. And so I want to start breaking down unlovability by talking about a lack of belonging. So it's this first element that we come to when we get into feeling unlovable, is this feeling of a lack of belonging, this experience of feeling like you just don't fit. And so after we talk about that, we're going to talk a little more about authentic belonging. But Malcolm essentially had a lifetime of feeling like he didn't quite fit wherever he was supposed to be. He was an African-American kid growing up in a small rural town in eastern Tennessee that was mostly white. He felt like every time he tried to step into a social space, he was kicked right back out. So he had many, many experiences of feeling like socially he didn't fit, he didn't quite belong. Malcolm also endured a lot of emotional abuse and criticism at home. He was smaller than his siblings. He was also a little smarter than his siblings, and so he frequently had the feeling that he didn't fit even in his own family. And so that was so painful and overwhelming to him. He just couldn't quite figure out, if I go out I don't fit. If I come back in, I don't fit. He said, I just can't find any of the places where I really belong. So when Malcolm came to college, he figured, well, the best way to belong at the University of Tennessee is to join a fraternity. And so he did that, and he had some experiences of fitting in, but it still wasn't belonging. And so Malcolm often said, I've got social survival. I can be here and I've got friends, but I don't really feel like these people know me for who I am, and I don't think that they would necessarily still keep me around if they knew who I really was. I don't think my values quite match up. I don't think I can completely be myself here. So Malcolm was always looking for the person and the place that might fill that need to just belong. And so when we talk about a lack of belonging, this is an unmet human need to be in real and reciprocal relationships with others. Real, because it has to be authentic. You have to be your real self. You have to own all the parts of yourself and feel like those are the parts that are accepted, not the part that's already been polished over or well-crafted or is polite or pleasing to others. This is about actually being your real self. Your real self is rarely all that polished and pleasing. And so it's also about reciprocity. It's about knowing that when you give to other people, they will also give back to you. And so you feel like there's this give and take. And it's not necessarily, I do one thing, you do another. It's not exactly this tit for tat. You might have years where you need more or give more than the other person, but it's this feeling that in the end, you are both looking out for each other. You really accept each other. A lack of belonging is especially important to talk about right now because of COVID. Out of all the mental health concerns that we have looked at in the last year, the number one problem is loneliness. Most people say the anxiety has come and gone, there have been waves of depression, but people have said that loneliness is the thing that started and the thing that is stuck and the thing that continues to be the most painful for them. And so we know that this is so significant because when we do research that looks at suicide notes, the single most common theme is a lack of belonging. So when people have made an intention to die and they've actually planned it out and written a note, this is the thing that comes up over and over and over, is not really belonging. And so by contrast, authentic belonging is this space where instead of feeling like you don't quite fit, you feel like you're just right, or right in enough ways for the people that you're around. Authentic belonging is, again, where you can really be yourself, and you can be your messy self, and you can be your better versions of yourself. You can be all the different ways that you need to be and still have people around. And the thing about authentic belonging is that there's a tremendous amount of subjectivity to this. Sometimes you might need one person. Other people might need to belong lots of different places. You might need to find more than one space to fit into. And so I want to think a little bit about this experience of authentic belonging. And this is so powerful that some interesting research that they've done has looked at football towns. And so they took mental health surveys at Ohio State and at University of Florida. And they found that when the teams had a winning season, the suicide rate dropped dramatically because everybody felt like they were a part of something. Everybody belongs. And if you guys have ever been to major sporting events, I mean, when you are winning, the person next to you might as well be your best friend. I mean, everybody is a part of the same family in that space. And so it can even be as simple as just feeling like you fit with the team, so to speak. And so there are a lot of impactful ways that we can find that we fit and belong. And so where do you find belonging? These are the things. We're going to have a lot of questions today. And like Katie said, we've got a handout that's going to go with the talk. But it's important to consider, where do you feel like you really fit? And where are the places where you feel like you might not? Where you might not be fully yourself? And so I want you to consider, how do you find belonging? Where are the places that you go? How do you find the courage to be a little more yourself? And where do you go from there? And this is frequently a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to show up and to keep showing up and to be vulnerable. And so just because you go somewhere once and don't feel like you completely fit or click, it's worth a couple of tries frequently to find the right people. And so how do you offer belonging to others? This is frequently a question of exclusivity versus inclusivity. How welcoming are you? There's likely somebody in your life who really, really needs belonging. And so when I ask my clients about this in therapy, they frequently tell me that they find that they belong in churches, at small groups, with groups of friends that they've known for forever, or even just their neighbors. I often find that my clients feel like they belong just by being a regular somewhere, just by going to the same coffee shop, knowing the same people, chatting with the baristas, feeling familiar. There can be a sense of belonging and community even in that. But this again requires you to show up frequently over and over and over. So I want to talk a little bit about how Malcolm found authentic belonging. So Malcolm came into my office one day, this is probably a couple of months into working with him, and he sat down and he had this strange look on his face and he said, I found a person. And I did not know if he meant he had found a dead body or what. I mean, knowing Malcolm, it could have been anything. And so he said, no, he's like, I found a person. He's like, I found my person. And he proceeds to tell me the story of going to a meetup group. He was really trying to find his people. So going to a meetup group, I don't know if that's still a thing or not, but went to this group, sat there, hung out for a while, found that same familiar feeling of like, this isn't quite me. I'm not clicking. Everybody else seems to be getting the inside jokes. And right before he was about to leave, somebody else got up to go. Another guy kind of got up, was going to sort of sneak off. So Malcolm figured, that is my exit point. I'm just going to kind of slink out of here and go back to where I started. And so as he's walking out the door, the guy who's in front of him turns around and says, you know, this is just kind of awkward for me. I don't think this is my space, I'm sorry. And Malcolm said, me either. And he said it was just the most liberating feeling to have somebody else acknowledge that they also did not belong. And so this other guy says, you know, I think I'd rather, you know, play some Call of Duty and get a burger. Malcolm says, that's exactly what I would like to do. And so that was the start for Malcolm. It was not the end, but this was just the start of feeling like maybe there's one person out there. All it took was somebody turning around and being a little more authentic than they might have been otherwise. And saying, this isn't my space, but I think there's another space for me. And so that gave Malcolm just enough confidence and just enough feeling that he fit somewhere and with someone at least, that he started to kind of get the ball rolling. He found more places that he fit. He started to look for more commonality. And that's something that's really hard to do when we feel anxious, when we feel depressed, when we feel insecure. The thing we tend to focus on is how we don't fit. We actually notice and pick up on the things that aren't like us. And so in that way, we create our own sense of alienation. And so one of the most difficult things you can do is exactly what Malcolm did, is to look around and see what you do have in common. Who is like you? Who might share a couple of the same things? What did somebody say that really resonated with you? So this is the kind of thing that you also have to look for. And so that's how Malcolm found his authentic belonging. It can be very, very small, and that small thing is very powerful. And so the next piece of this puzzle of feeling unlovable is burdensomeness. Sorry, I forgot that I've got a PowerPoint up here. So I want to talk about perceived burdensomeness. And so I'm going to continue to use Malcolm to illustrate this concept as well. Malcolm always had the feeling that he was a problem for others. Like I said, he grew up in this family with a lot of siblings. They did not have a lot of money, and he felt like just covering his basic needs sometimes was a problem to others. He felt a sense of burdensomeness about the money that he spent, the food that he needed to eat, the rides he needed to get to school and other places. Malcolm constantly felt like a burden. And then getting to college, as a first-generation college student, Malcolm felt like every time he made a mistake, he was creating more problems in the world, that somebody else probably deserved his spot more. And he came in one day and he said, I think I really fumbled the ball, and I don't deserve to be a part of this team. And we had a lot of football analogies in therapy in Knoxville. But he said, like, I think I'm letting everybody down all the time. I don't see where I add value. And so that's what it feels like when you have a sense of burdensomeness. And Malcolm hit on all the most common ways people tend to feel that they're a burden. We often focus on how much time we take up for other people. The cost, the time that it takes for somebody to drive you to the airport or drive you to school like Malcolm said. We focus a lot on feeling like we're going to drain on resources, people's energy, people's money. It's common that we find that we feel ourselves to be a sense that we find ourselves to be a burden around performance, academics, grades, work, that you're letting someone else down if you aren't doing more or doing the most, or if you screw something up. Kids in particular find that they feel like they're a burden anytime they mess up. Feeling like misbehavior, so to speak, is a real problem. If only I hadn't had that problem, gotten in this fight, left that purple pen in the white load of laundry. Making mistakes can contribute to a huge sense of burdensomeness. And then also conflict in relationships. We often feel like every time we have an argument or share something painful with somebody else, that we have created a sense of burden on them. And so the most important thing to know about this aspect of feeling unlovable is that it's false. It is a misperception. It's an inaccurate belief that you take more than you give, that you have no real value, or that you are actually doing damage to the relationships that you have and to the world as a whole. And so, again, research shows us that people believe themselves to be a burden, and they can go through that whole process of explaining how and why. And yet, when you ask the other party if they feel the same way and in what ways somebody might be a burden on them, they don't actually match up. So it's completely normal to have needs and to take and to sometimes create problems in the world. Once again, this is a part of being human. And so not only is this something that is inaccurate in its belief, but it also tends to be rigid. So it can be hard to shake somebody out of this. And because it's rigid and it feels bad, it's hidden. And so it's incredibly important to start to recognize and think about where you might see yourself to be a burden. And even when you find places that you are in fact a burden, it's important to remember this is usually minor and it's usually temporary. It does not match the degree at all typically to which it is felt. And so it's normal to find that mismatch in the world. And sometimes you may need more than you give for short periods of time, and sometimes for long periods of time. And so it's important, again, to think about how you do the antithesis of this. How do we perceive ourselves to have value and contribution? Where do we find what we have to give and actually focus on that? And this can be small. It can be just showing up someplace like today. It can be just being in a room. You have value just by sitting on the sofa sometimes next to somebody who cares about. And if you need to feel like you have more tangible contribution other than just being yourself, then it's important to think about your values and how you actually tie that to your day-to-day. And so we frequently in therapy will ask people to think about what's important to you. If you had to sort of list out your values, what are they? And people tend to say relationships, or the environment, or doing something good in the world, being a part of a group. And so the challenge here is to take something that feels so big and so global, these values, and tie them to your everyday life. And so we tell people, take this huge value and break it down into a goal. And take that goal and break it down into small steps. Things you can potentially do on a daily basis so that every day when you pick up a piece of trash, you can remember, I'm doing something that feels significant to me. In my everyday life, I am doing what is worthwhile. And so when it comes to values and finding worth, these are usually things that, again, they stay so global, they stay so big. We never really have the opportunity to connect to them and find the opportunity to just express them. And so that's one way we look for contribution and value. And so the other way we do this outside of ourselves is to look for the ways other people contribute in our lives. Where's the contribution and what is the value that people bring to you in your relationships? And so it can be something significant, it can be something small, but frequently this is about just expressing appreciation. Just noticing and acknowledging and commenting on what somebody else does. These are things that most people say they think all the time. I think all the time about what a great person this friend is and how happy I am to have them in my lives. But it's rare that we tend to say that out loud. And it's even more rare that we find the tangible thing in the moment and comment on it. And so you might think, that's so nice that my significant other loaded the dishwasher. but do you have a habit of saying that regularly? And so, again, it's worth considering where, how, and in what ways do you feel yourself to be a burden to others? And how do you start talking about that? How do you start actually checking that out? And this is a tremendous risk to take. It is very hard to ask this question and to check this out, but it's very important because, again, we know that most often this is a misperception. And so how do you start to have conversations about being a burden? And then also, how do you find ways to contribute? Again, where do you express those values? How do you do for others? And again, this can be as small as being kind to the person who gives you your coffee in the morning. And for other people, there is likely somebody in your life who potentially believes they are a burden to you. And again, this can be hard to see, which is why it's important to ask, just to check it out. The most common place where people feel like a burden, the most common experience is for teenagers to feel like they're a burden on their parents. And so in particular, parents, it's important to ask if there are moments when your child or your teenager feels this way. In part because they should naturally be having more experiences of this. There's not as much opportunity for autonomy. You can't necessarily do things for yourself. You can't pay for the things you want or need. You might need rides places. You need more care, and that's completely normal. But that is one important place to start looking if you're a parent. And how do you set the record straight for other people? How do you let them know that's not true? I don't feel you to be a burden in the way that you're feeling this right now. And how do you acknowledge others' contributions? How do you actually start to notice and comment on and say what you value about other people so they can start to shake off this belief that they might be a burden? And so let me come back to Malcolm again and talk a little bit about how he challenged burdensomeness and found contribution. So, true to style, Malcolm overcame this outside of our therapy sessions and in an unexpected way. Once again, he came in, he sat down, had a funny look on his face. I always knew something was about to happen. And he said, "I found a dog." And I thought, oh my gosh, you have found a dog. And he legitimately, this is a side of the highway, mangy, medium-sized, needy, emotional dog that he has found on the side of the highway. And so Malcolm adopts the dog, and it was one of the best things to ever happen to him. Not so much because it was easy for him. This dog generated a tremendous amount of stress. This is the kind of dog that howled in the middle of the night, and it growled at all his neighbors, and it was sort of an eyesore at different points in time when he was trying to get whatever was happening with his fur under control. But Malcolm loved that dog, and he named this mangy beast Buttercup. And so Malcolm and Buttercup, they had this transformational experience together. And what really was impactful to Malcolm is that he realized another being can have needs, can eat all the time, can stress him out financially, can take up more time than he ever anticipated would be taken up. And he could still love and find tremendous value in this dog. And so he had to start also thinking about how maybe he had misperceived that in himself. It's just enough to shake this belief and give him a completely new perception that even when somebody takes a lot, they give a lot too, and it is frequently worthwhile. And so Malcolm also found that he now had a space to very tangibly contribute. Every day, taking care of Buttercup was an opportunity for him to see that he was doing something. He was caring for another human being, or another being, I should say. And so that was an experience where Malcolm could actually very much feel that he was giving, where frequently he felt like he was taking. And so Buttercup helped Malcolm just completely reframe this experience of being a burden. And again, this isn't where it stopped for Malcolm, but this is where it started. This is where gears started to turn, and he started to have an experience that challenged what he had always believed to be true. And so that brings me to, the last component, which is shame. And this is quite possibly the most painful component of feeling unlovable and the most difficult to overcome. So when I talk about shame, shame is the belief, the deeply held belief frequently, that we are unlovable, that we are bad, that we are fundamentally flawed somehow. And so shame, this feeling of I am a bad person, becomes global and it becomes immediately overwhelming to ourselves. People often describe this experience of feeling stupid or weak or broken or incompetent or unfixable. We have a lot of different words that we use when we experience shame. And it's often a mismatch between this ideal version of ourselves that comes and is created from a million different places, from individual relationships, from culture as a whole. It feels like a mismatch between the ideal self and how we really see ourselves, and a mismatch between how everybody else potentially sees us, how we've presented ourselves, and how we really see ourselves. Shame is very different from the experience of guilt. Guilt is the belief that I did something bad. I did a bad behavior. I did a bad thing. Whereas shame is I am a bad person. And so guilt frequently comes with an opportunity for reparations, for restitution. We can fix the things that we've done if it's just a behavior, if it's just something that we did. Shame, because it feels like it's who we are as a person, is something that often feels to be unfixable. And so it's really important to observe the differences between guilt, I did a bad thing, and shame, I feel like a bad person. And so when we experience shame, the urge here is to hide. And we have a million different ways of doing this. But the idea is that don't let anybody else see me. Don't let them really know the parts of me that are messy, that are uncomfortable, that are incongruent with how I've tried to present myself to the world. And so we hide in a couple of different ways. We hide just by straight up denial to ourselves and to others. Sometimes we don't even allow ourselves to recognize things that we don't feel good about. We hide by just not talking about things with other people. Or we hide by telling stories that are partly real, but mostly sanitized. We can make a joke out of something that actually is really painful. We also hide through overcompensation, to be particularly nice and kind, maybe inauthentically so, if sometimes we feel like we aren't all that nice of a person deep down inside. We hide through substance use and other behaviors that help us simply turn off to our experiences and to the world. The goal here is to just not exist. And so if you've ever felt shame, you know that shame also comes with this incredibly powerful physical experience. You want to fall through the floor. You turn red. People go hot. People go cold. You lose your language. It completely scrambles your brain, essentially. Also, when we're humiliated in particular, the part of our brain that experiences pain lights up. If you've ever been shamed by another person, it's almost as if they literally hit you in the face. That's how your brain reacts. And so this experience is just incredibly overwhelming. And it comes with a thought process that says, nobody else fill in the blank. Nobody else drinks like I do. Nobody else feels anger or expresses anger like this. Nobody else is selfish in the ways that I'm selfish. Nobody else had this terrible thing happen to them and reacted the way that I do and did react to this. And one of the important things to know about shame when it comes from a traumatic experience is that we usually have more shame at how we reacted to something than what actually happened. It is more about how we see ourselves frequently than what exactly happened to us. And so with Malcolm, I'm not going to talk too much about his shame, but his shame could be tremendous because he experienced abuse and traumatic events and felt like I must be a bad person for this to all come together, and I must be a bad person for the ways in which I reacted to these horrible things. And Malcolm also had the small, everyday experiences of shame that we all have had. Saying something stupid at a party, getting a terrible grade, not studying, and then getting the terrible grade, having a sense of deservedness around it, forgetting to let Buttercup out one evening. Lots of these small things that come together and help us feel like I must not be a very good person. And so the opposite of shame is dignity and compassion, and also, which is not on my slide, acceptance that we are all vulnerable and fallible. And so the way in which you overcome shame is by talking about it, which is the last thing that anybody wants to do when they feel shame. Because shame carries the belief that if people really knew me, they would not want to be in a relationship with me. If you knew how selfish I really were, you wouldn't love me anymore. If you knew what happened to me in the past, you wouldn't want to be around me. And so shame hides and therefore makes it almost impossible for us to overcome it. And so overcoming it is about starting to talk about shame, but to start with small doses, sharing small shames, small pieces, and finding safe people. This doesn't really work if you find somebody who judges you and shames you for it. And so it's important to think about, who are your safe people? Where can you start to be more authentic? Where do you acknowledge who you are, how you are, what you've been through, how you're incompetent and inadequate, when you felt degraded or dehumanized? And so we have to start small, and we have to start in safe spaces. And these encounters lead essentially to the understanding of what it is to be a human. And so when we start to share these things, what we often get back is me too. It's exactly what Kate said when she was talking about Will for Hope, where once they started talking about Will, other people were able to say, me too. It is a human experience to go through hard times, to have unattractive traits, to be incompetent. And so this is that opportunity to realize this is actually something that can connect you in the world instead of disconnect you like we fear. And so the more you talk about this, the more spaces you find, the more opportunities you also give other people to overcome their own shame. And so it's important to think about what shame you may have, how you hide, and what small shame you can start to acknowledge. And again, it's important to start small, because shame can be something that can become so disorganizing, it can be overwhelming. And so if you have a shame that feels tremendous, this is where therapy can be of great value, because there's somebody who is trained to help you manage that process physiologically and emotionally when it's overwhelming. And so how do you start to own your own unattractive traits and come into just your humanity? And who in your life may also be holding shame? Again, because this is hidden and because we have a tendency to overcompensate, the very person who might need your shame might be the last person that you really want to give it to, because they've hidden it so well sometimes. And so you think, well, this person is shameless, which is also not a good thing. But frequently when we see that, it lets us know there's probably a little more to that story. And so when you encounter brokenness in other people, how well are you able to acknowledge it, to comment on it, and to share your own stories, to help somebody feel like this is just a part of being human. This makes sense. This is understandable. This is a human characteristic. This is a trait that people have. And so Malcolm overcame shame by simply showing up to sessions. Because when you're dealing with shame, you frequently don't even want somebody to look at you. You don't want to be seen at all. And so for Malcolm just to show up and sit with me and start to be a little more real every single week, he started to overcome his shame. And this is probably the only thing that I did in the course of our year together. I just sat there and listened. And that is really all that is required sometimes, is just to sit and express compassion. Not pity, not so sorry for you, and this is, pity comes with sort of a top-down approach. This is about compassion. This is about actually connecting through suffering. Being able to just sit with it and acknowledge it without getting overwhelmed by it, without trying to dismiss it. Oh, that's not so bad. Let's make that go away. And so I simply had to sit and listen in Malcolm's sessions. And becoming a little more authentic in one safe space allowed him to start to do that in lots of other places. And so I want to tell you guys one more example of overcoming shame, and it's probably one of the more poignant things that I've been able to witness in therapy. So this is several years ago. We had a situation in one of our group therapy sessions where we had a teen who disclosed something uncomfortable and inappropriate that had happened sexually. And so we talked to her after group and we said, we really need to bring your parents into this. And it was devastating to this teen. She said, we cannot talk about this. They cannot know. And so we worked with her to figure out how are we gonna talk with them. This is really important. And so her parents came in, and she's sitting on the sofa, mom's sitting next to her on the sofa. Dad's sitting next to me, and we're sort of, everybody's sort of on pins and needles as to how this is going to go down. And so she eventually sort of gets out the story of what's happened. And her mom sits there for a minute, and everybody is holding their breath. And her mom goes, "Oh, honey." She goes, "I was promiscuous when I was your age, too." And we all sort of sit there wondering where this is going. And she says, "I just want you to know," she's like, "you know that I had a hard life," which apparently her daughter knew a little bit about her story. And she said, "I've had a lot of hard things happen to me." She's like, "When I was younger, I thought that I could make up through that with certain people and in certain unhealthy ways and in certain relationships." So she said, "I was really promiscuous, and it came from not feeling good about myself." And it was the most compassionate response she could have possibly given her daughter. And it was the exact opposite of what her daughter was anticipating, the exact opposite. And so the mom continues, and she says, "Actually," she says, "I felt that way for a really long time, and somebody came along, it made me feel like I wasn't broken at all." She's like, "And that's when all this stopped." She said, "I felt like a good person." And I'm sitting there thinking, and what's going to happen next? And the dad pipes up next to me and goes, "That was me." And mom smiled. She said, "Yeah," she said, "that was your dad." She's like, "He gave me this experience of feeling like I was okay. Like all the things I had done and all the things I had been through were just a part of being a human, and that I was better than that." And so in one of what could be the most excruciating scenarios in therapy, to have a daughter talking about her promiscuity with her parents, we had the absolute most compassionate experience I have ever witnessed. And so it is a very, very powerful thing to be able to acknowledge this for yourself and also to be able to give this to someone else. And so when we think a little bit about dignity, dignity is about self-control and worthiness. And when we think about compassion, it's not pity, it's about meeting people in their suffering and feeling with them. And so this is what is important to think about, is how you might be able to give this to other people, as well as how you give this to yourself. And so what I want you guys to leave here with is not just some understanding of these concepts, this experience of feeling unlovable and the triad that makes it up, a sense of burdensomeness, a lack of belonging, a sense of shame. But what was most important is to be able to take from this the fact that you can actually overcome all of those things. Because when you're in the midst of feeling unlovable, it is a dark hole and it feels like you cannot get out of that. And again, this could be something that is large, this could be something that is small, but the goal is to find out how we give to ourselves and others a sense of feeling lovable. How do you generate belonging for yourself and for other people when there may not be any? How do you overcome the false belief that somebody is a burden to you or that you are a burden to them in order to find contribution and value in your relationships and in the world? And then how do you find dignity and compassion, and how do you give that to other people? And so that is where we are going to leave things. And you all have got an amazing opportunity to join small groups this week. And so I hope you will do that, because that is an opportunity to actually start these conversations right away. And I think that is the end of our recorded portion.